You know, they say if you watch anything long enough, it will start to surprise you. The yard had never been so silent. Stuart froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. The frantic chirping of the crow family in the old Douglas fir, his constant companions for 4 years, was gone. The absence of sound was a physical void, making the ticking of the kitchen clock unbearable. He quickly stepped onto the patio, his eyes scanning the yard until they found the nest where the crows were usually in. It was still, too still. His gaze dropped to the damp earth beneath the tree. There, like 2 fallen mottled fruits, were the chicks. Oh no. They were all scruffy feathers and clumsy with oversized feet. Around them, the parents swooped in frantic, screaming arcs, agitated. But what struck Stuart most, what would stay with him for years, was their eyes. They weren't looking at their fallen young. They were looking directly at him. In their glossy depths, he saw no fear, only a desperate, watchful need. There was no trust in their gaze, but he could tell they were anguished enough to accept his help. Without a second thought, Stuart dove into action. He knelt, his aged knees cracking in protest, and gently gathered the 2 warm, breathing fledglings into his palms. He could feel their hearts beating frantically against his skin. Just like the judge, he thought, a sudden, sharp memory of the injured fledgling he'd rescued decades ago flashed behind his eyes. He pushed it aside. It wasn't the right time to remember the past. He placed them carefully in the sturdy, forked branch of a smaller maple, safe from the prowling neighborhood cats. But he was a practical man and knew that they might fall again. So he went back to his kitchen and returned with a small terracotta saucer. He filled it with water and placed a generous pile of unsalted peanuts beside it, right at the base of the tree. It was familiar to him. He'd helped countless birds that way and could only hope that it would be enough for the sickly chicks and even the adults. He repeated this ritual every morning for weeks. The chicks thankfully survived, grew stronger, and eventually mastered the dizzying art of flight. The feeling of triumph as he saw them fly off was ever so familiar. The immediate crisis was over, and Stuart assumed life would return to its quiet observational norm. He'd never been more wrong. Stuart had been watching crows for most of his life, and he believed he'd seen all their tricks. Their cunning, their mischief, the way they could solve a puzzle faster than a dog, and even some people. He'd even had one, the judge, live with him for 11 years. After the judge was gone, Stuart understood the boundaries of their relationship. He was the observer. They were the observed. It was a simple, quiet arrangement, and he learned to prefer it that way. Until now. The first surprise appeared a week after the last fledgling had taken to the skies. Stuart had only just finished talking to one of his children, Evelyn, who lived in another city. It was her umpteenth time of trying to convince him to adopt a dog. "It will keep you company," she said, and he just laughed it off and changed the subject to the weather. He was a man built for such solitude. An Army veteran and avid reader, his home was a sanctuary of order. Books aligned, surfaces clear, a place for everything. This tidiness extended to his birdwatching. His journals were meticulous, filled with dated entries and somewhat detailed sketches of corvid behavior. He'd been a devoted watcher since his youth, but his connection ran deeper than most. At the military base, he spent a lot of his breaks on the grass with binoculars staring up at the sky and into the trees while his mates played card games, smoked, or just goofed around. They had teased him relentlessly for his hobbies, earning him the nickname the Crow Man. He had mainly laughed it off. His late wife, then a dainty girlfriend, Marie, had gifted him a journal to document his findings. "You might as well put that journalism degree to use," she had teased. And he had. After hanging up, he went about his evening rounds, sweeping the already clean patio when he saw it. There, placed with impossible precision in the very center of the empty terracotta saucer, was an object that made no sense. It was a dried fig threaded through the metal ring of a soda can pull tab. It was odd, out of place, and in no way matched the maple tree it was under. Stuart frowned. It was too deliberate to be litter. A child's prank? Unlikely. His yard was fenced, and there were barely any children in the neighborhood. Not that anyone would have a reason to play such games. He made sure to stick to himself and only made sure to return the greetings of the other elderly neighbors. A few of them had made it a routine to visit him or invite him for a game of Scrabble. There was the occasional game of chess he had with an older man in the park. The young college teen who worked at the grocery store tried to engage him in a conversation now and again, but that was as far as his social interactions went. Stuart looked up. On the lowest branch of the tree sat the male crow. He knew because he had a limp. He was perfectly still, watching Stuart, and just when he thought the crow would do something, it spread its wings and flew away. He warily eyed the odd item before picking it up and going back to his chores. The next day, it happened again. This time, it was a twisted piece of silvery wire, coiled into a neat spiral. The day after that, there was another gift. Coincidence was no longer a viable explanation. A profound, world-altering realization settled over Stuart as he picked up the third present. They were giving him offerings. Gifts, he thought. It couldn't be by chance, could it? They had recognized his aid and were responding in the only currency they had. The tokens of shiny, carefully selected, crafted objects, and a few other trinkets, which he wondered where they had swiped from. Stuart had never seen this before. He had helped countless birds, particularly crows, and none of those intelligent creatures had sought to repay him, especially not in this way. Not even the judge, his unlikely companion that he'd rescued as an injured fledgling, had given him such odd gifts. He had nursed the crow back to health, and the bird refused to leave his side. Stuart, half exasperated, had named him after Cormac McCarthy's character in Blood Meridian, because the crow kept perching on the book whenever he tried to read. The judge had been more than a pet. He was a confidant, a clever, mischievous presence who understood a dozen words. It could also recognize faces and perfectly mimic Marie's laugh in a way that chilled Stuart to the bone after she passed. And as intelligent as he had been, Stuart could not recall the bird gifting him. Birds didn't do things like this, or maybe they did, and he just never paid enough attention. Stuart's peculiar relationship deepened. On his afternoon walks through the woods behind his property, he became aware of the soft escort. The crows would follow him, their dark shapes flitting from tree to tree in the canopy above. The limping male grew bolder, often flying down to land on a stump or a low-hanging branch just a few feet ahead, pausing to ensure Stuart was following before flying on. It was almost like the crow wished to say, "Here I am, keep following." And Stuart did. He often wished there was something he could do about that dreadful limp, but it looked like an old injury that had healed wrongly. He was relieved that the adult male seemed to get by without problems. They were walking together. He would often laugh at the incredulity before he began talking to them. "Afternoon, friends. Fine weather today." Sometimes he would get crows in response, and sometimes the swoop of their feathers. Still, he continued with their odd acquaintance, listening to them flock around as he tried to fix one of the hinges on the fence. He had even asked one of them to pass him a bolt at some point and couldn't contain his chuckle. It was the first time one of the birds mimicked his laugh. It did startle him for a moment before he recalled that they often did that. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he sat by the window, pen poised over his old journal. His handwriting had grown shakier since his minor stroke, but his notes were as detailed as ever. June 7th. The male, Corvus, as I have decided to call him, followed me today. Sat close enough for me to see the healed break in his leg. Intelligent gaze. Reminds me of the judge. but he is quite temperamental, and his missus gives him an earful. Their third batch of fledglings took flight only a few days ago. I wonder how much larger their family could be. He hesitated before closing the book. I hope that damn bird isn't bothering you too much up there, Marie. Stuart thought. He was sure she, in turn, bothered the judge just as much. The crow had grown on Marie as she dutifully kept breadcrumbs and water on the patio every morning until chemotherapy left her weak and old. When she died, the judge stopped cawing for an entire week. It seemed to follow that 2 years after his death, at the jaws of a raccoon had hit Stuart almost as hard as Marie's. Stuart's children had been with him for both occasions, urging him to come live with them and leave that old lonely house. He had convinced them to return to their lives, insisting he was fine. Marie had lived a good life. She had been 10 years his senior, and he liked to think the judge lived well, too. They had been very different companions, and their exit left a silence in his heart that was only partially filled by the chirping of crows in his yard. The same crows that still chirped as he put away his journal. He reasoned it was time for another walk. It was during one of these walks that the final piece of understanding clicked into place. He had settled on the old weathered bench at the edge of his property, the one that looked out over the woods. There was just enough shade to make the afternoon sun seem cool. The phone in his hand buzzed, and he accepted the routinely scheduled video call from his children, Evelyn and Tom, who had finally grown curious about his crow army, as Evelyn called it. He tore open a packet of crackers from his pocket, a habit he'd developed for these walks, and began breaking them into pieces, scattering them on the mossy ground in front of the bench. The response was immediate. A soft flurry of dark wings descended. They weren't frenzied as one would expect, but almost languid and collected. It was like they knew it would be more than enough for them all, as it was routine. The female adult and 2 of the now fully grown fledglings hopped forward, plucking the morsels with deft flicks of their beaks. He recorded them for a moment before turning the camera back to himself just as Evelyn was mid-sentence, complaining about a demanding professor. She stopped, her eyes widening. "Dad, wait, turn it back." He turned the lens back to the birds. "They're just there. They're so close to you." Tom, even as the usual pragmatist, leaned into his screen. "No way! You've never trained one to stay around. How did you get so many?" "It's not training, Tommy," Stuart said softly, his gaze drifting back to the crows. What was it then, he thought. Stuart didn't know exactly, but for some reason, this family had decided to stay with and around him. He watched as Corvus, ever the bold one, hopped onto the arm of the bench, his clawed feet making a soft tick-tick sound on the old bench. He was close enough that Stuart could see the individual feather barbs on his chest and the intelligent, ever-curious gleam in his dark eye. "It's just like the judge," Evelyn breathed, her voice full of wonder. "Remember how he'd sit on your shoulder while you read?" Tom hummed in agreement. "Yeah, and when you shoot him away, he'd just perch on your book." Stuart remembered all too well. He tended to think about it a lot as well, especially with this limping adult's mannerisms being so similar. "Maybe he never really left you, Dad. Maybe this is his family." The thought, spoken aloud by his daughter, landed not as a logical idea, but as a giddy theory. Perhaps Corvus and his mate Sabine were the judge's descendants, a new generation, somehow finding him and sticking beside him. The lineage of it, the sheer weight of this inherited friendship, settled deep in Stuart's chest. It was completely surreal. "Maybe," was his response. They delved into simpler conversations, including plans to visit for the Christmas holidays. Tom would be bringing his wife and children, and Stuart could not wait to see them again. As much as he enjoyed his solitude, seeing his family together in the house was always a memorable experience. He was also sure the children would be excited by the crows. "Yeah, I should be done with the semester about a few days before Christmas, so I'll just buy my train ticket in advance." Evelyn and Tom went back and forth on her means of transport. He believed coming a plane would be faster and safer. She wanted to cut costs and travel cheaply. They always bickered over everything. He looked from the faces of his children on the screen to the wild black birds at his feet and on his bench. What he shared with this wild family was spectacular, defying all his years of meticulous observation. They weren't pets. They were partners in a silent, mutual agreement. He, the birdwatcher who had spent a lifetime observing, was now being observed in return. They enjoyed his company, trusted his presence, and in doing so had filled the veiled loneliness in his heart, not with noise, but with a quiet, purposeful companionship. Something he hadn't believed he needed. As if to seal the thought, Corvus on the bench arm let out a low, rattling croak and tilted his head, his dark eye holding Stuart's gaze. It wasn't a blank stare. It resembled the one he gave when he needed Stuart to do something, like follow him and stay on the right path during the walk. Stuart looked down and realized the others had finished with the crumbs of crackers, and he threw some more. This time Corvus fluttered down to eat as well, occasionally snatching the crumbs right from the other fledglings. A slow, easy grin spread across Stuart's face as Sabine pecked the trouble-making adult. "I'm really happy you're doing well, Dad. Haven't seen you smile this much in a while," Evelyn said softly, causing his smile to falter. "Yeah?" Tom agreed. "Now we can worry less." Stuart shook his head with a small laugh, wiping off the dusted cracker crumbs on his slacks. "I never want to make you guys worry. I'm fine." He was certain he was now, at least. They talked more until the sun went down and the wind grew a bit too cold for his aging joints. "I have to go," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "It's getting dark, and I've got to make dinner." He bid his children farewell, their goodbyes laced with laughter and continued wonder with the crows, and ended the call. For a long moment he sat in the silence of the woods, a silence accentuated by the soft caws and rustling feathers of his companions. Finally he rose, and the crows took to the air as an escort, leading him back towards the house. They perched on the branch of the maple tree closest to the porch as usual. Now they had multiple nests, and even as one of the fledglings took the skies, Stuart wasn't worried. He knew they would come back. They always did. Stepping inside, Stuart closed the door softly behind him, the familiar quiet of his home now feeling different. It was no longer an empty silence, but a peaceful one in which he was now comfortable. He put the kettle on the stove as he prepared the ingredients for dinner. There were still chores to do, books to read, crows to feed, and a crisp